Each drawing tool and each type of paper has its own characteristics that influence the nature of the resulting drawing. The illustration, drawing tools and their characteristic lines gives you a little bit of a sense of the different qualities of marks made by common drawing tools. So we have a pencil, we have two different types of charcoal sticks that work there, a brush, a couple of different kinds of pens that work as well. You'll notice that some of the tools give a dry, refined line, whereas others are wet and a little bit more expressive. Notice also how each tool responds to varying degrees of pressure. The ink brush in the middle is the most responsive, showing the most variety of line, and the pen at the bottom has the least variation. So it's much less expressive than a brush, and artists will choose one over the other depending on their intentions for the work of art. Darkness and line quality are determined both by the degree of hardness of the pencil and by the texture of the drawing surface. Pencil lines can vary in width or length. They can be made by using the side of the pencil point to make a broad stroke, and they can be repeated as hatching. Artists will often draw rows of parallel lines to suggest shadows or volume. These rows of parallel lines are called hatching. Cross-hatching is a drawing where one set of parallel lines occurs on top of another one so that the lines overlap. This cross-hatching gives texture and it allows for the value contrast of the drawing to build in a different way than hatching alone. Contour hatching are the use of parallel lines that curve to suggest a volume in space. So we see all three different types of this approach to hatching in the drawing by Charles White from 1952, Preacher. White used contour hatching to capture the curves of the face. We see simple hatching in lighter parts of the wrist and of the shirt. He used cross hatching abundantly, at times curving the lines to create volume. So if you look at the underside of the palm of the hand here that's outstretched, you can see that kind of curving cross hatching that is occurring. But most obviously, we can see the cross hatching in the back of the drawing, shading surrounding the head. In a later module, we'll take a look at printmaking. Printmakers use all three types of hatching to show form and to suggest mass and shadow. Dry media can include pencil, charcoal, Conte crayon, and pastel. We'll take a little bit of a look at each of those things. The sticks of charcoal used today are similar to those used by ancient peoples to draw on cave walls. Both are simply charred sticks of wood. Varying degrees of hardness controls the darkness and the line quality. With charcoal, dark areas can be drawn very quickly, including a wide range of light and dark values, from soft grays to deep velvety blacks. Natural charcoal creates a soft, scattered line that can be easily smudged and erased with just a few flicks of a cloth that looks a lot like the kind of cloth that you might use to dry your car after washing it. We call it a chamois. So the natural charcoal that we're talking about here would be an actual piece of willow bark that has been baked to a high degree until it is reduced down to a solid sort of chalk-like quality of black charcoal. So there are no additives to this type of charcoal, and that's part of the reason why it has this easily smudged and erasable quality. For more durable layers, in other words, for areas where we need a denser dark or we don't want the charcoal to be so vulnerable to the brush of a hand or to the eraser, we need a denser material to get these darker values. And so this denser charcoal is called compressed charcoal or also charcoal pencils. Umberto Boccioni used a variety of tools and techniques to create his abstract drawing, States of Mind, The Farewells. In this drawing, we can see sharp lines, we can see strokes that are wider. Those would be made with the side of the charcoal. We can see Boccioni using parallel hatching lines and also shading in areas. We see many shades of gray in this remarkable drawing, Web number 5 by Bija Selmans. The web emerges from the darkness at the upper left as the artist carefully shaded each concentric circle. She made only black marks, letting the paper show through for the white portions. So all of the subtleties of the web's exquisite complexity, imperfections, and the places where we see symmetry or relatively equal spacing happen, all of those white areas are simply left as the white of the paper. Okay, so there's no white pencil here. There's no white charcoal here. These are small drawings. I was fortunate enough to see an exhibition of Beecher Selman's work in Los Angeles not too long ago. She's an important artist working in a realistic mode today. And I do happen to have an Art21 short video interview with Beecher Selmans for you to watch as one of the supplemental videos at the end of this episode. We can see a very similar quality, though, to the texture of the drawing and the deep richness of the blacks and the use of the paper in this drawing by George Seurat. So this drawing was not made in charcoal. It was made in a medium called Conte crayon. This is black Conte crayon on Michelet paper. Seurat used the Conte crayon to build the illusion of three-dimensional form through various value gradations. So again, we come back to our use of dark and light to create a sense of the form. And we know the term for that is chiaroscuro. So the Conte crayon is used for this chiaroscuro effect in the drawing. Conte crayon was developed in France at the turn of the 19th century, so it's relatively new compared to the baked forms of willow bark that we saw previously. It is perhaps the best known of artist crayons. It's made from a compressed pigment that is mixed with a type of clay, so the pigment can be made into whatever form the Conte crayon would ultimately be needed by the artist. So you can use Conte crayon in a stick form, similar to charcoal, or you can use it in a pencil as well. Okay, so the clay is kind of like a binder that holds the powdered pigment together and allows it to be shaped. The amount of clay also determines how hard or how soft the crayon is. Conte crayon can produce varied lines if you use it on its edge, or it can create broad strokes that resist smudging a lot more than charcoal will. So that's one of the reasons why an artist might prefer to use it. In L'Echo, Seurat used Conte crayon on rough paper as a means of concentrating on basic forms and the interplay of light and shadow. Seurat actually drew this drawing with a multitude of lines, yet the final drawing, the individual lines are obscured by the total effect of the fine texture of the light and dark areas. This type of drawing is sometimes called a tonal drawing, using shades of black and gray with literal or no visible lines. In this example, we also see how the quality and the type of paper that an artist uses has an important impact on the drawing. Much of the atmospheric quality that we see here comes from the artist's highly sensitive response to the texture and the surface of his paper. Drawing surfaces, paper can be rough or smooth to varying degrees. We use the term tooth to talk about the quality of roughness or surface grain that gives texture to a drawing. So a tooth, there could be a tooth to a paper, or it could be a very smooth paper. George Seurat worked on a very toothy paper to draw this child's face and his cupped hand in L'Echo. And we see in the detail of the larger work the weave of the papers and how expressive they are in the final look of the drawing. Another type of dry media, this time in color, is chalk pastel. Natural chalks of red, white, and black have been used for drawing since ancient times. We've seen quite a few drawings that were made with red chalk, including the one by Michelangelo in the previous episode. Pastels were produced in the 17th century, and they have a characteristic that is similar to that of natural chalk. There is a freshness and a purity of color to the use of pastels because they are composed of mostly dried colored pigment. They have very little binding material or additives in them. We mentioned the way that clay played a role in the formation of Conte crayon in the previous slide. Chalk pastels have very little of that binding material, and so they tend to have a brilliant color range and a creamy consistency that is just luscious to blend. But pastels yield the most exciting results when not overworked. So we're going to take a look at two portraits, two drawings that were done in chalk pastel, both of which have a very different approach to the use of materials and as a result, a different look. Venetian portraitist Rosalba Carriera made dozens of works with pastels in the early 18th century. Her portrait of a girl with a bussola shows her sensitivity to the medium. The hard, fine-grained pastels in common use at that time give the finished work a smooth surface that makes possible fine color shadings. So the early pastels were harder, a little finer grained. Okay? Because of the artist's light, sensitive touch with short strokes of the pastel, the work really resembles an oil painting in its appearance, and that effect is also enhanced by the fact that the work is made on a very smooth piece of paper. Soft pastels don't allow for a lot of explicit rendering and detail. They tend to encourage the viewer to work really boldly. And in The Swaying Dancer, or Dancer in Green by Edgar Degas, we see both approaches to the use of the charcoal pastel. This composition and many of Degas' compositions show casual, fleeting glimpses of everyday life. And so this is actually a drawing that would have been made while observing dancers backstage in preparation for the performance. You can see how Degas alternated between careful blending and more expressive layering of the strokes, especially when we look at the edges of the costume worn by the dancer, who is most visible in the foreground of the drawing. We can see the way very expressive zigzag movements with the charcoal pastel. They remain, if we were to see this drawing up close, it would just look like an expressive mark. But from a distance, it begins to look like a decorative element on the dress itself. Drawing inks generally consist of ultrafine particles of pigment suspended in water. Black and brown inks are the most common drawing liquids. Some brush drawings are made with washes of ink thinned with water. These types of ink drawings have similarities to watercolor painting, actually. We can see the use of broad shapes of color, as well as the brush being used to create line work in both of the drawings on the slide that we're looking at now. Today, we use many different types of colored ink in contemporary ink drawings. We also have artificial felt and fiber-tipped marker pens that can be used to create a similar effect. 19th century Japanese artist Katsushika Hokusai, skilled and prolific at drawing, is said to have created about 13,000 prints and drawings during his lifetime. Japanese culture in the 19th century considered calligraphy to be the most direct expression by artists. In Tuning of the Samisen, Hokusai uses a brush and calligraphic ink, which are traditional in Japanese art, to depict a figure playing the instrument. The expressive elegance of the bold contour of his lines was made possible by his great control of the responsive brush. And this is what makes this drawing a complete work of art. In Eliezer and Rebecca at the Well, the 17th century artist Rembrandt van Rijn used liquid media to sketch quickly a compositional arrangement for what might have become a possible painting. Pens of varying widths yield ink strokes that show the speed and the quickness that this drawing was made with. So if we look carefully, especially at some of the forms in the background, sort of quick pacing, very gestural, scratching with the pen, quick hatching with the pen, not a careful, detailed, purposeful stroke in the same way that we see in the Hokusai drawing, where we have a sense of the slow and careful lifting and pushing on the brush to release the liquid ink. Rembrandt used parallel hatching lines for darker areas and further darkened several of these regions with a brown wash, especially in the right half of the page. In a few places, such as near the foot of the cliff at Eliezer's knee and near the top of the mountain at the right, we can see that Rembrandt lightened his previous shadings by applying white gouache. Gouache is a type of opaque watercolor. This drawing shows Rembrandt at his most spontaneous and is most likely a study for a painting. Some artists today create drawings and offer them as finished works because they value the immediacy and spontaneity of a drawing. One of these is the South African artist William Kentridge. He created this drawing for Lulu by using both wet and dry media over pages of an obsolete dictionary. He told an interviewer that he enjoys working on such paper because it represents faded authority. This work is a portrait of the composer Alban Berg, whom the artist admired. The quick execution of the drawing finds a parallel in the casually slapped together pages. He also created drawings for animation, in which each drawing is photographed individually and then projected in rapid succession, similar to movie frames. So I have included a link to an Art21 video on William Kentridge, where you can see one of these animations and hear the artist talk about his ideas and his process. A comic is a sequential art form that is based on drawing. Comics are a popular art form for tackling social, cultural, and political issues. Printed comics represent the culmination of a development that includes some ancient Egyptian murals, medieval tapestries, and some print series created in the 1730s. So they're not an entirely contemporary phenomenon. Comics and graphic novels rely heavily on drawing as a means of communication. Graphic novels resemble comic books, but have book-length storylines. So a comic can be as simple as one frame or one page. Graphic novels have a similarity to novels in that there is a longer narrative than a traditional comics format. Marjane Satrapi is an Iranian-born French contemporary graphic novelist, illustrator, animation film director, and children's book author. Persepolis is her best-selling, internationally acclaimed memoir in comic strips. Persepolis tells the story of a young, precocious, outspoken girl who grows up in Iran during the 1979 revolution and its tumultuous aftermath, which included the Iran-Iraq War. She, her family, and others around them struggle to adjust to living in the new Islamic Republic with its oppressive rules. Many of them also rally around one another, putting their survival and comfort regularly on the line for the sake of love and self-determination. So in an interview with the author, the question, did you consider writing a novel first? What was the pull for you for relating the story in drawings? Came up. To which the author responds, there are many reasons for it. First of all, the primary language of human beings is drawing, not writing. Drawing is a universal language. If you want to describe an emotion, when you draw someone with that emotion, no matter where you come from, you understand it. Put the human being in the center of attention as someone with hopes and dreams, a mother and a father, and people would find it harder to go to war with them. So Marjane Satrapi has repeatedly highlighted through talks about Persepolis as both a graphic memoir and a film, ultimately, how important it is for her that the audience perceive her tale as relatable. And we can hear that in her response to the interviewer's question. The simplicity of the visual style of her drawing is intended to represent the age of the young protagonist. She says, I'm starting my story when I'm 10, so I can't make a very complicated drawing. I wanted to actually draw in a way that would show the evolution of the age of the character. It looks like it's very simple, but it's actually very complicated to make something simple. It was really months and months and months of work for this author. She says, I had to actually force myself to draw like a real grown-up, because if you see the evolution of the complete series, you will see in the fourth Persepolis book from 2003 that I actually don't draw like a little kid anymore. Everybody can identify with me, she says. My mother, my father, everyone. And in that way, the story becomes universal. In using the simple graphic novel form, my whole thing was the universality of the story. Today's artists have considerably expanded the definitions and uses of drawing. Many use it in combination with other media in finished works. Some artists create works in new ways using new media and label them as drawings because no other name quite describes what it is that they do. Julie Moretto, for example, uses media from both drawing and painting in the same large works. Her large work, Back to Gondwandaland, includes colored swatches of cut paper along with drawn ink lines. The composition explodes in an outward cacophony of gestural marks and expressive fields of color laid over what appears to be the architectural rendering of a massive stadium. Back to Gondwandaland captures the at times overwhelming density of the city landscape, or the sensation of our experience of that density. You can almost hear the sound of the traffic when you look at this drawing, or feel the sensations of what it would be like to move through the architectural space with a furious pace. These are expansive drawings with an all-over sense of detail, and viewers are necessarily drawn into the chaotic energy as they examine these drawings at close range. So if you look at these from a distance, everything coalesces or converges. It becomes a total kind of sense of action and chaos. But in the close-up, the picture fragments into individual events. And this is important in the conceptual framework for the artist for this drawing. Moretu utilizes architectural spaces as inspiration for her works, such as airports, flight plans, sports arenas, military compounds, skyscrapers, and city plans, and these become the first and early layers of her abstractions. Moretu says, "I think architecture reflects the machinations of politics." And that's why I'm interested in it as a metaphor for political institutions. I don't think of architectural language just as a metaphor about space, but about spaces of power, about ideas of power. If drawing has been traditionally an organic process, at least in the ones that we have looked at up to this point, Moretu's work do not look entirely handmade. Rather, these drawings exist in the gap between the natural and the manufactured, between drawing and painting. Paper is not the only support used for drawings. Artists can draw on virtually anything. Chicano artist Luis Tapia, a slice of American pie, used a 1963 Cadillac. Inspired by lowrider culture in New Mexico, Tapia sliced the car in half and then he placed it in a frame. He then painted designs made to look like drawings on the side of the car. These images reflect the style and the themes of both the local religious art and tattoos. The drawings on the Cadillac range from a view of Santa Fe Cathedral and the Hand of the Virgin of Guadalupe to a road sign for the historic Route 66, all of which would have been signs and symbols related to the culture of New Mexico. His work tends to represent and challenge traditions, challenge mythologies, challenge stereotypes. He uses icons and he melds traditional and contemporary sensibilities. His cultural pointedness and sense of humor infuse this work with a sense of place and a sense of identity. An increasing number of artists have begun to routinely employ digital screen-based drawing techniques and to create works of art with them. Carla Ganis, for example, makes self-portraits by taking selfies and then altering them using these new media. In the selfie drawings is a series of 52 works that she created over the course of 1 year in 2015. She put her photographic self-portrait through all sorts of manipulations, adding text or drawing, adding layers of color or cropping and duplicating. Many of her drawings refer to earlier works in the history of art. Number 41 in the series, which we're looking at here, shows her own body poking out of a Tower of Babel, which is based on a famous 1563 work with that title. Ganis creates some of the clouds that roll by with the clone stamp in Photoshop. We see the artist herself doing financial calculations on a screen with a stylus. The numbers are backward, as if she were writing on the other side of a transparent screen. So I think that it's interesting because we can see that backward writing possibly as a reference to the way Leonardo da Vinci wrote backwards in his sketchbooks. Artists throughout history have made self-portraits as vehicles for self-examination. Ganis sees herself in the latest media and she filters her identity through historic images. So there's a merging of the historic and the contemporary in these works. So that takes us to the end of episode 2, everyone. And so I do have a reflection question for you, which is, how are contemporary artists reimagining the process of drawing, the use of drawing materials, and the elements of line, texture, and value? We looked at a couple of examples here, and there are more in the chapter on drawing in your book. So feel free to choose one of those and have a conversation about what you think about their reinvention, the process, and what does that mean for the way that it looks back to historical processes in drawing. Another option, or instead of the discussion, is to take a look at the 3 short videos on artists we have discussed in the past episode. Vija Selmans, William Kentridge, and Julie Moretu. They are all artists who are currently working today. These 3 are all from the Art 21 series of PBS. They're very short, and they give a great amount of insight into why these artists do what they do. We'll see you again for the next episode of Module 4, where we'll start our conversation about the Renaissance, Baroque, and Rococo art in Europe.